Welcome to the Korea Now podcast. I'm your host, Jed Lea-Henry, and on today's show we have William Mako. Now, in the late 1990s, the Thai government decided to float its currency, the Thai baht. Almost immediately, the currency began to devalue and investors began to flood out of the Thai market. Now, Thailand was a fairly small economy, but the spin-on effects of this ratcheted through Asia. A financial contagion hit the region, and before long this had found itself to the door of South Korea, at the time the world's 11th largest economy. This was a society that had based its modern identity around economic success. They had patriarchal ideas around government where the citizenry effectively trusted their leaders to make the right decision, and where the economic landscape was of people finding jobs in large corporate enterprises, the Chaebol, and keeping those jobs for life. The idea of people being laid off, or of a job being temporary, was in essence a very un-Korean idea. But as the Asian financial crisis hit, this is exactly what happened. Suddenly Korea had to look inwards at huge structural debts that had been building up over years inside its large Chaebols. Debts that had been given by the financial sector, by a series of banks that were handing out financing without regard for due diligence. And behind it all, a government that had used this model as the foundation for economic growth. And this is where William Mako comes into the story. William was working with the IMF, and the IMF were dragged into the crisis when the Korean government were unable to halt the economic slide. Debt levels were out of control, the corporate sector was defined by bad business practices, and at one point in late 1997, the country only had 8 days worth of reserves to pay for its imports. South Korea was on the brink of bankruptcy. Now, how did they get themselves here? Well, there's a fascinating deep history about this, dating all the way back to the Japanese occupation, to Park Chung-hee, and the specter of North Korea, and of a new Korean war looming over the Korean peninsula. In many ways, security concerns drove reckless economic development. Behind the crisis, and what is often too easy to forget in moments like this, was a nation and a people and a society that was suffering. People were losing their jobs, corporations were going bankrupt, and a social stigma was easing its way through society. Koreans suddenly felt a deep shame, the idea that they had to be bailed out by foreigners, they'd be saved from their own mistakes. And throughout all of this, William Mako was on the ground, working with the IMF, implementing the structural reforms, and working through the negotiated packages. He witnessed the crisis firsthand and helped to oversee the recovery. This is a rare insight into a defining moment in modern Korean history, something that people still speak about today and warn of into the future. Now, as always, this podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. So if you want it to continue, please consider donating at the Patreon account attached to this podcast, www.patreon.com/Jed Lea-Henry. So, without any further delay, this is William Mako. William Mako, welcome to the Korea Now podcast.
Happy to be with you.
So today we're going to be speaking about the IMF crisis in Korea, but I suppose it's important first to go back a little bit here. Some people may not remember, some people may not know in the first place, so just what was the Asian financial crisis at the end of the 1990s?
Well, the Asian financial crisis really got going in about July 1997. There had been a long period of economic expansion and credit growth in countries that had been referred to as the East Asian Tigers. So it was countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Taiwan, and Korea. What happened was, as is typical in financial crises, the market became more and more ebullient about economic prospects and returns on possible new capital investments. So there was major investments in all of these East Asian tiger economies. And then finally there was a market break. There was concern that Thailand in particular was overextended. And the foreign creditors for Thailand started recalling their debt, calling the loans they had made to Thailand. So there was a pretty pronounced capital outflow at that point, and the Thai baht was devalued in early July 1997. That set up a situation for market contagion. Financial investors start thinking, well, if one player like Thailand has gotten into trouble, what else is out there? They started looking around. They started worrying about, I believe, a little bit Malaysia at that time. There was a steady drumbeat of insolvencies in Korea during 1997. You had about 13 Chaebol went into bankruptcy during 1997. And then also in nearby Taiwan, they were having similar problems, and there was a devaluation of the Thailand dollar in October 1997. So at that point, there was more and more concern among foreign creditors who had lent heavily to South Korean banks, which had in turn lent these loan proceeds to Korean Chaebol or Korean conglomerates. So credit lines were not getting re-extended. There was pressure on foreign exchange reserves as people were converting in from Korean won into dollar accounts, and as foreign creditors were recalling their dollar-based loans to South Korean banks. So there was a precipitous drop in foreign exchange reserves, such that by December 18th, 1997, there was only about 8 days worth of reserves left, foreign exchange reserves in Korea. And at that point, the South Korean government called in the IMF and agreed to work jointly on a program.
And that's where you came into the process here. So just for a little bit of background as well, tell us exactly how you came into this, because at the time when the IMF were brought in to help restructure things, this is when you found yourself in Korea as well.
It was a little bit after that. I got there for the first time at the end of February 1998. I had by that point been working in the World Bank since July 1997. It was interesting. I was on a pre-employment vacation on a lake in Wisconsin when I heard about the Thai baht devaluing, and I thought, I wonder that's interesting. I wonder how that will play out. So, of course, I ended up working in Korea and Thailand and all of these countries eventually. But it was funny. I come into the World Bank from private sector consulting, where I'd mostly worked in the past couple of years, the past several previous years in Eastern Europe on USAID and World Bank financed contracts to work on privatization of state enterprises and capital market development in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. So I got to the World Bank in July 1997, and suddenly I had nothing to do. It was very disconcerting. So I did a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And in February 1998, I ran into a senior manager at the World Bank whom I knew from Russia and Ukraine when we had both worked there. And he said, well, what are you doing? And I said, well, not much. And he said, well, you want to come to Korea? I'm taking a mission out there. So I went along with him. And then I found plenty to do. And I gravitated toward corporate restructuring of these distressed Korean conglomerates, also known as Chaebol, because prior to working in Eastern Europe, I had been in this private consulting firm's bankruptcy practice in New York City. So I had some background in bankruptcy. So this was a good fit for me. So when I did start working there in February 1998, I guess one of the first things we did was take a look at the financial position and financial performance of the top 30 Chaebol. Until that point, a lot of the attention had gone to the banks, the capital position of the commercial banks, the need to nationalize or recapitalize, restructure and recapitalize the big commercial banks. This manager I'd worked with in Russia and I, however, focused the World Bank's attention much more on corporate restructuring of these distressed Chaebol, and figuring out some sort of an out-of-court corporate restructuring workout framework. So we worked, this other guy and I worked pretty closely with the Financial Supervisory Commission, which of course was the regulator and supervisor for the commercial banks and non-bank financial institutions in Korea. So we worked on that. We did our assessment for the World Bank and the IMF on corporate distress. We advised the Financial Supervisory Commission on a framework for out-of-court workouts. And then later on, I guess it was July 1998, Korea was going to need an additional $2 billion of lending from the World Bank. So we started working on identifying a set of conditions that the South Korean government would have to fulfill in order to receive that $2 billion of lending. That loan is what was referred to at the time as Structural Adjustment Loan Number 2. So it was a $2 billion SAL 2, as we called it. And then after that, it was clear the Financial Supervisory Commission, and more particularly the big commercial banks, which were trying to restructure distressed Chaebols and distressed Chaebol debt, would have benefited from some sort of technical assistance in terms of how to do debt restructuring. So we put together $100 million corporate and financial sector corporate restructuring assistance program, which was then used to provide corporate bankruptcy lawyers, accounting firm to do due diligence, and investment banker advisors for 4 or 5 of the big banks there.
So that's an important point there, I suppose. So it sounds a lot like, so people that are maybe uninitiated with this, when you arrived in Korea, or when you first became aware, sitting on that lake in Wisconsin, about this crisis that was hitting and eventually moving its way through country after country to South Korea, it sounds like the country was effectively on the brink of bankruptcy. So you've got a number of charts here, and you have this. You mentioned just before that it was effectively South Koreans were dumping their own currency. They were investing in foreign reserves. The won itself was being dramatically devalued, and I suppose I could get you to speak about the nature of the debt that was being held at this time, because over the years, South Korean companies, South Korean firms and banks have been building up a huge amount of debt, and it was fundamentally unsustainable debt.
Yeah, that's right. They'd had a funny. The government, certainly since Park Chung-hee came to power in 1961, had always tried to keep a pretty tight grip on the financial sector. So they didn't really want the Chaebol borrowing, going offshore and borrowing on their own a lot of dollar-denominated or yen-denominated debt. For whatever reason, I guess it makes sense to try to centralize things. The Korean government had a preference at the time that it be the Korean banks that went and borrowed money from Japanese banks and from Korean banks, from Japanese banks and from United States banks for the most part, and then on lent to
the Chaebol, I think, yes?
To the Chaebol, yeah. So what happened there? And nonetheless, I mean, what you saw was a really massive amount of capital investment and a huge run up in leverage. So, for instance, between 1988 and 1996, annual increases in the amount of capital investment by Korean corporations was about 22%, which is a massive amount of capital investment growth over an 8-year period, especially when at the same time sales were growing at only about 17%.
And I suppose especially when you consider how much of the Korean economy the Chaebol made up.
Yeah, at that time, the Korean Chaebol accounted for about 67. Korean Chaebol revenues represented 67% of GDP. So, you know, these were referred to as Korea Inc. And there was a feeling that they couldn't fail, so they kept borrowing and borrowing to fund this massive capital investment. A lot of which was in unrelated businesses. So you had Chaebol that were perfectly good at building automobiles, then deciding they wanted to get into chip making, or you had Chaebol that was perfectly good at consumer electronics, decides it wants to get into automobiles. Everybody got into construction. Everybody got into financial services. So with this massive borrowing to fund all this capital investment, by the end of 1997, the Korean corporations, on average, their debt equity ratio was 3.6 to 1. Now, which is, I mean, that's really quite over leveraged. I mean, in the United States at that time, instead of 3.6 to 1 as it was in Korea, in the United States it was 1.3 to 1. By 1996, Korean corporations, their operating cash flow was only 40% of the interest they needed to be paying back to the banks. And of course, as they invested in more and more things, the profitability of the things they were investing in decreased. So you saw a fairly precipitous decline in corporate returns on equity from about 11.5% in 1988 to negative 3% in 1997. So, and part of the problem was that the Korean corporations, the Chaebol, always thought the government would bail them out, right? That they thought, because the Korean government had done so before. And a major example of that was in August 1972, when President Park Chung-hee provided a 3-year suspension of debt repayments to what was referred to as the curb market. There was a lot of lending going on outside the bank. In addition to this 3-year suspension, they capped interest rates. You know, so this was a massive, massive hit, and frankly, usurpation of property rights for private lenders, and really a free pass for the Chaebols that had been borrowing in that market. So the Chaebol got to thinking, well, you know, if we got bailed out once before, we'll get bailed out again. So, you know, these kind of practices created enormous moral hazard, where the Chaebol thought, well, we can do whatever we want. We can borrow as much as we want. We can invest however we want. And if we hit the wall, the government will bail us out. So it was a real test for the new Kim Dae-jung government in early 1998 to put us, to both achieve, stabilize the economy and achieve a corporate and financial sector turnaround, but try to put a halt to these bailouts, which had created this tendency had created this moral hazard situation, which created these incentives for overborrowing and overinvestment.
Now, before we get into Chaebol a little bit deeper, because I suppose that's an aspect of this that you focused on primarily, and it's in many ways it's the most interesting aspect of the crisis, this fascinating, uniquely Korean aspect. But before we jump into that too much, I suppose we've touched a little bit more on the financial sector itself, because of course the debt being racked up by these Chaebol was at least being facilitated not just by the government but also by the banks and the financial sector that was lending to them. And you have this very interesting line that I read. You refer to these banks as non-commercial commercial banks, that effectively they had forgotten that they had become privatized.
Yeah, well, these had always been very, very weak banks. So the five biggest banks, frankly, I don't think they really had ever functioned as standalone commercial banks until through 1997, in any sense that would be recognizable to an American commercial banker. The background of these banks is that they were originally run by the Japanese. And owned by the Japanese during that period from 1910 to 1945, when Korea was a Japanese colony. They got nationalized by the Korean government after liberation and independence in August 1945, and then you had the fairly corrupt Syngman Rhee government, which tried to privatize these banks in the mid-1950s, but typically they were going to start up industrial conglomerates, which might have also come out of privatized Japanese properties, with very, very dubious privatization arrangements, with the deals going to Korean businessmen who had been providing financial contributions to President Rhee's Liberal Party, and then having these nascent industrial groups borrowing the money from the banks to buy the banks. So it was a pretty shady set of privatizations there in the 1950s. The banks got renationalized after Park Chung-hee became president as a result of a military coup in May 1961. There was a good bit of financial repression, as we would say today. Citizens were basically forced to save money. The Park government was very, very heavily into directing credit allocations, right? So these were these remained state banks after their renationalization until the 1980s. So typically they didn't have a credit assessment function on their own. These banks would be waiting for a call from the Blue House telling them which Chaebol to lend to, with the Blue House making decisions based on each Chaebol's relative success, first in import substitution, right? Sort of building up certain businesses to substitute imports from abroad, and then export promotion. So the whole idea that President Park was trying to do was to build up a military industrial complex, and he saw the Chaebol as being, his partners in that. So he wanted to provide them all sorts of rewards for success in import substitution and export promotion. So the rewards might be, licenses to enter new businesses, favorable access to foreign exchange, maybe some tax waivers, directed credits from these state-owned banks. Anyway, these banks had a long history of not really making credit decisions on their own. By the time they got reprivatized in the 1980s, a lot of these Chaebol had already by that point become pretty large and successful businesses, and I think there was a natural tendency to continue lending, increasing lending to these Chaebol. And I can't remember who was paired up with who, but certainly certain Chaebol had specific commercial banks as their lead lenders. So, of course, when you've got a government making credit decisions, quite frequently it's not going to work out. So, there were lots of problems periodically in the late 1960s, 1970s. I mentioned the big bailout, I guess, in August 1972, and some further credit hiccups in the 1980s. But, they would recover from these things. They would do some sort of, perhaps cosmetic workouts or debt restructuring, and then continue onward. The global economy, the East Asian economies were pretty ebullient in the 1990s. The lending kept getting bigger and bigger until we got to the situation I talked about at the start, where not just Korea, but several of the East Asian countries got into trouble in 1997.
So from that financial legacy, that idea of banks, you have these wonderful stats, and you show that at the time there's 27 commercial banks, and 2 are insolvent, 14 have low capital, 11 seem okay, but they have dodgy accountancies, and of 30 merchant banks, 25 become non-viable, 33 insurance companies, 18 are distressed at the time. And so from this incredible landscape of heavily leveraged banks who've got all this bad debt out there. Let's come to the Chaebol for a second, because you mentioned that Chaebol, so this is the heart of this. So you said that the Chaebol were effectively leveraging more and more and more and more and more. But you have this wonderful claim here, and I suppose this is important to remember here, that these are family-owned businesses, and they're run from as a family control tower. And the Chaebol were taking risks, but they were taking risks with other people's money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. It was, it was a fairly clever pyramid scheme. So, for instance, of the top 30 Chaebol, in terms of who was putting the equity in, and you have to remember that a Chaebol, it's not like an American holding company, right, where you've got a holding company at the top. And it has a bunch of subsidiaries and a clearly defined relationship. The Korean Chaebol were sometimes described as more like a convoy, right? That you would have a bunch of affiliates, right? So there's not necessarily any holding company, but the family would own some equity in each of the affiliates. And then the affiliates might own equity in each other. And you might have a situation where a particularly successful affiliate would use its success to borrow more heavily, and then take those borrowings and invest them in whatever bright idea, for future business, the controlling family in the non-holding company control tower wanted to invest in. So, for instance, in mid-1997, if you look just at equity, 57, a majority of equity, 57% was held by outsiders. For instance, public investors in the stock market or joint venture partners, but only 4% was actually owned by family members, right? And the remaining 39% was owned by other Chaebol affiliates. So it was a massive series of cross shareholdings. If you look at, well, even if today, if you look at a corporate organization diagram for Samsung, which you can find on Google, for instance, I mean, you've got a bunch of different affiliates all over the graph with ownership lines going back and forth. And it's very difficult to make sense of this. I mean, it really looks more like a bowl of spaghetti than anything else. So you've got 4% ownership by the family, which might be controlling this out of a very small family office. I remember, for instance, in 1997, Samsung, which was, I don't know, the second or third biggest chaebol in Korea, it was being run out of a small company called Everland, which was a family-owned company, I think, in the real estate business. So the idea was each chaebol would have a few really, really successful affiliates. It could be in construction, it could be in automobiles, whatever. And then it would use that success in order to go to the banks and pledge its assets or whatever and just borrow up to the hilt, and then take those borrowings and invest more equity or debt from the affiliate in new affiliates that the family wanted to develop. So, or sometimes the strong affiliate would provide cross-debt guarantees, right, which was another way of getting into trouble. So I recall that when Kia went bankrupt, I think in July 1997, the problem was not with Kia Motors, which was doing quite well at the time. The problem was with Asian Motors, which I think made buses, and a specialty steel affiliate that was in the Kia conglomerate. And what had happened there was Kia Motors provided cross-debt guarantees for borrowing by the bus builder and by the specialty steel affiliate. So when those companies couldn't repay their debts, the debt guarantees on Kia Motors got called and dragged that into bankruptcy as well. So it really was playing with other people's money. 4% equity on average by the family, and through clever financial engineering, just being able to borrow enormous amounts of money with higher and higher leverage in order to do more and more capital investment, which ultimately turned out to be non-viable and unsustainable in many cases.
So from that basis there, that sort of messy corporate structure, it's important here. You mentioned earlier about Park Chung-hee, and I suppose it's important here to mention his one of the driving messages, one of the animating theories of his life, and this was the prospect of war with North Korea. And what he said, at least as part of his government's policy here, is rich nation, strong army. And I wonder if you could take us back into some of Park Chung-hee's legacy and just why, just how this affected his interaction with the Chaebol.
Yeah, well, he's remains a controversial character in Korea. I mean, some people see him as the guy who really built the country. Some people see him as a sellout to the Japanese, as a self-aggrandizing, immoral type of character. It's interesting. I taught graduate students in Korea for the past couple years, And we would talk about the Korea case when we would talk about successful cases of economic development. I mean, Korea really is a startling success, this particular crisis notwithstanding. And of course, Park Chung-hee was in power from 1961 until he was assassinated by his KCI director in, when was it?
It would be 79, I think,
yeah,
or 80?
1979. Yeah, that's right. And it's interesting. My students the Koreans all had sort of a similar reaction, which was he did a great job, but he stayed around for about 10 years too long. So I mean, when he and the junta took over in 1961, I mean, the country was really the economy was really adrift. You had these fairly corrupt businessmen which had acquired old Japanese assets in both industry and banking and were not doing very much with it. You had a lot of state intervention, setting prices, controlling the foreign exchange market, overvaluing the currency, which of course, creates a situation where you have to actually administer access to dollars, which creates a situation for corruption. And it just wasn't going anywhere. I mean, even infrastructure wasn't going anywhere. And when the junta came in, I mean, it's really quite striking how quickly they were able to do things like organize the electricity sector. So they put 3 electricity companies together pretty quickly, which the previous government had been unable to do, and that's what is today known as KEPCO, right? It was a very quick thing to do. The Park Chung-hee government, an early initiative was building the expressway from Seoul to Busan, which he drove through. Including heavy involvement in the mapping out of where the expressway was going to go, and that was quite an amazing initiative, and created a lot of impetus for development of both Korea's construction sector and development, and since you now had a place to drive efficiently, impetus for the development of the Korean automotive sector. But in any case, going back to the controversial aspect of Park Chung-hee, of course, he was a soldier in the Japanese army, and the Japanese army was occupying Korea. So he enlisted. He was a junior officer. He graduated from the Japanese Military Academy, I guess, in Tokyo, in 1944. So he had his development models were not, market-based, laissez-faire types of development models, such as we're used to in the United States, but rather development models from the Meiji Emperor and from the Showa era emperor, in other words, Hirohito, where you had very strong government involvement in helping guide the economy, government involvement in helping guide corporations, and creating a conducive business climate, including favorable corporate access to bank lending. The concept in Japan, and of course a lot of this was driven by the Japanese government's desire to have a strong army and a strong navy in order to fend off the Russians, make inroads in China, and fend off the Americans and the British. So the Japanese concept, Fukoku Kyohei, was the same as the Korean concept, which came right out of this Park Chung-hee's idea, Bukukgongyong, in other words, rich nation, strong army. So this is what he really straight off wanted to do. So within a year of taking power, Park Chung-hee was thinking about heavy industrialization, creating steel sector, an automotive industry, chemical industries. I mean, all of the sorts of things that you would need in order to be able to build and operate an army on your own. It took a while for him to formally announce this. He announced heavy and chemical industrialization program, HCI, in January 1973. But he had been making efforts almost immediately after taking power to encourage, and it was basically financial repression. I mean, forcing citizens to save their money in Korean state-owned banks, so that these state-owned banks would then provide directed credits, right? Credits directed from the Blue House to facilitate heavy and chemical industrialization. So there was and he was quite clever about it. He when he took power in May 1991, his first reaction was, I mean, he actually had sort of a socialistic background, and in fact, U.S. Army intelligence was always thought there was some possibility that he was actually a closet communist. But so it wasn't clear what way he was going to go when he took power. There was some thought that he might just seize these privatized industries and just build a strong state-owned enterprise sector. When he did take power, when the junta took power, a lot of these corporate financial sector leaders were thrown in jail for tax charges, or because of feelings that the previous privatization transactions had been conducted in a corrupt manner. And he quickly came around to thinking, well, instead of throwing these guys in jail and having to rely on the government to develop heavy and chemical industry, it would be better for me, Park Chung-hee, to use these guys, to use their native entrepreneurship and drive and energy and business savvy to do this heavy and chemical industrialization for the government. So this has got into this sort of scheme where he first encouraged these corporations to succeed in import substitution, right? So instead of importing steel or small machines or whatever from more advanced countries, he would get these corporations to develop these products so that they could substitute for imports, right? So companies that were successful in import substitution got all sorts of preferential access to business licenses, directed credits, tax breaks, etc. And that then moved on from import substitution to export promotion. The idea here was he wanted these heavy industrial and chemical companies, heavy industry including shipbuilding, steel, metal fabrication, automotive, to grow big enough that they would also be able to sustain separate military production, right?
And at some point during that, it all gets kicked into a much higher gear when the Guam Doctrine comes in and Richard Nixon puts this shock through the economy and everything suddenly ratchets up, it gets turbocharged.
Yeah, it was interesting because there was this funny major bailout in August 1972, where instead of dealing with distressed companies on a case-by-case basis, Park Chung-hee provides a blanket bailout. In 1969, there had been a liquidity crisis that affected 86 corporations. And they dealt with these pretty much on a case-by-case basis. Nobody went into bankruptcy court. I mean, the government didn't want to trust the courts to handle this, so they ran it out of the Blue House. So those 86 companies, 30 were deemed non-viable and they were just nationalized. And of the 56 companies that were considered viable, the Blue House did the workout itself, right? And for each company, it distributed losses among the banks, among the Chaebol, the Chaebols and the Chaebol owners, and the workers through employment reductions or wage freezes. So up until through 1969, the tendency had been to deal with these instances of corporate distress on a case-by-case basis. Now, after that, there was, as was always the case in Korea, you'd have a buildup of investment and debt, a little bit of a crisis, you'd resolve it well enough, and then the buildup of investment and debt would continue. So by 1972, of course, this had happened again, but he didn't deal with it on a case-by-case basis. He provided this blanket bailout that I talked about, which included a 3-year suspension of debt repayments to the what was referred to as the curb market, and a cap on interest rates, which actually reduced financing costs by about 67%. So this was a massive bailout and a massive tax on the private lenders. And so there is some speculation, some questioning, like why did President Park go from a case-by-case management of distressed corporations to just this blanket bailout for distressed corporations, creating this situation of moral hazard for the future. And there's speculation that it was actually a minor character in this was Richard Nixon. As you may recall, it was in July 1969 where Nixon had just become president 6 months earlier. He had gotten elected on a platform of getting the United States out of Vietnam through Vietnamization, right? Where the South Vietnamese were going to take over the war, and the United States was going to withdraw its ground forces and only provide air and naval support. So there was that going on. In Korea, Nixon had decided that U.S. forces in Korea would be reduced by about 1/3. So U.S. forces in Korea drew down from 61,000 to 41,000 by mid-1971. And there was an end to, it was stated that the U.S. government was going to end economic aid by end of 1969. So the supposition is that at that point, Park Chung-hee sort of became very, very alarmed that he was suddenly going to be on his own, that the South Korean government could no longer trust the United States government to support it in its defense against North Korea. And the supposition is that at that point, Park Chung-hee wanted to kick HCI the heavy and chemicals industrialization initiative into overdrive, right? So through the 1960s, I mean, every year there were a few HCI projects directed by the Blue House. But after 1971, after Nixon had announced the Guam Doctrine, the one-third reduction in U.S. forces was underway, and U.S. economic aid was ended. There was a lot of encouragement by the government of South Korea and subsidization for the Chaebol to simultaneously enter into multiple unrelated industries. So it was not just vertical integration or vertical investment, it was horizontal diversification investment. Chaebol's investing in everything. So it's a curious sequence of events, and people who know more about this topic than I do think it is, and who've studied this topic a lot more than I have, think it's entirely credible that some of the things Park Chung-hee was doing circa 1970-71 to really accelerate Chaebol growth was in fact a response to changes in the U.S. Security and defense posture vis-a-vis East Asia and South Korea in particular.
So that's a very interesting picture there of just how a moral hazard can compound over years and build towards this crisis. And we've spoken a lot already just how this moral hazard played out in the financial sector and the Chaebols and how this bad debt and bad business practices built up. But it's important to also note here that beyond just the bad business practices, there was also complete outright fraud in some cases. And you talk a lot about, and I think you actually worked directly with the heads of Daewoo, which was this one of the great big Korean Chaebols. And it collapsed at the time. And I have in front of me a graph that you've sent me, and it shows the difference between what Daewoo said that they had on their books in terms of accounting and what they actually had. And as you run through the total list, they say that they had 14 trillion won worth of reserves. And in fact, they had, well, about negative 30 trillion won in reserves. So that's a 43 trillion won difference in what they said.
Yeah, absolutely. By July 1999, I think July. Let me think about it. I think I remember I was at the Outer Banks of North Carolina, and I was on the phone on this. So that would have been actually August 1999. Chaebol could no longer service its debts and had to go into this out-of-court workout scheme with its big banks. And at that point, the banks were putting sort of management monitoring teams and forensic accountants into the big Daewoo affiliates in order to figure out what was really going on. And what had been going on was that these different affiliates, for instance, Daewoo Corp, which was in which was the real trading company, Daewoo Motors, Daewoo Heavy, Daewoo Construction, Daewoo Electronics, a lot of their revenues and assumed profits had come from buying and selling to each other, or from revaluing assets upward, or by transferring overvalued assets to each other, right? So there was no real business going on here. Unfortunately, at that time, the practice in Korean corporate accounting for situations like this was to produce combined financial statements rather than consolidated financial statements. In combined, you would just add all these things together, right? You would, whereas in proper consolidated financial statement, which is supposed to be the norm now in Korea and has been the norm in the United States, you would net out these related party transactions, right? So they shouldn't have been there they would not have been in a properly consolidated group-wide financial statement. So when they did that, they just said, well, there's 43 trillion won here worth of spurious related party transactions going on. So instead of having overall positive 14 trillion won of equity, it was a negative more than 28 trillion equity whole. It was negative equity with liabilities exceeding the assets by 28 trillion.
And of course, Daewoo effectively goes bust after this. It goes down. And this brings us back a little bit to what we mentioned at the start here. So as the crisis kicks through, as it starts to run, this contagion kicks in. And suddenly where no one was looking for risk, no one was believing that there was risk around any corners inside the Asian markets or inside the Korean markets, suddenly around every single corner, people believed that there was risk. And this contagion rattled through the markets. And Korea tried certain measures to halt off this crisis kicking in, but no one was buying it. There was just no confidence left in the market, at which point the IMF comes in, and at which point you come in as well, and you give this huge loan to the market itself. So let's talk about the IMF package. Just what was it about? Was it an ordinary IMF package? What did it do for the Korean economy? How did it restructure things?
Okay. The IMF and the Kim Jong-sam government at that time in December 1997, the Kim Jong-sam government signed a letter of intent with the IMF indicating that that government would undertake certain reforms, particularly in terms of macroeconomic stabilization and interventions in the financial sector as needed, which could include nationalization of insolvent banks, restructuring of bank assets, which would probably realize a whole losses, and recapitalization of these banks to achieve so that their recapitalized capital would achieve capital adequacy. So upon this agreement on this letter of intent, it was to be the case that the IMF was ready at that point to provide over a 3-year period $21 billion of funding. The World Bank and ADB would provide $14 billion, and bilaterals, including the United States, were ready to provide another $23 billion. So it was totally a $58 billion package. It was interesting. The markets did not initially really respond well to this. It continued to be the case that Korean banks were unable to roll over the short-term debt that they had with American banks, Japanese banks, and European banks. So they still couldn't get the debt rolled over. So there was concern that a lot of this money that the IMF might put into Korea would just end up being used to repay foreign commercial banks in the United States, Japan, and Europe. So one of the big initiatives that I think probably doesn't get enough attention, I mean, people tend to focus on the IMF and the IMF encouraging interest rates to go up to roughly about 40% for overnight money in order to give people an incentive to hold on to the yuan instead of converting into dollars. But even that probably wouldn't have been enough, or would have taken time to get implemented. But I think the thing that doesn't, and everybody focuses on that interest rate spike because it was pretty dramatic and pretty painful when it happened, and people don't pay enough attention to a restructuring of the foreign bank debt, and that may be what really turned things around. As Korea was heading into crisis, even with all the loans that had been recalled by the American, Japanese, and European banks, there was still $36 billion that Korean commercial banks were going to have to repay to commercial banks in America, Japan, and Europe during the following year, 1998. So what got done with a lot of planning by both the existing Korean government under Kim Young-sam and by the incoming Kim Dae-jung government, and with help from the IMF and the U.S. Treasury, was to negotiate both a standstill with these American, Japanese, and European banks, which got it put in place by mid-January 1998, and then to achieve agreement with these 134 banks in 32 countries that these monies of this $36 billion, only 17% of it would get repaid in 1998, 45% would get repaid in 1999, and 38% would get repaid in 2000. So that was a major advance that bought a lot of breathing room for what became the Kim Dae-jung government to stabilize the situation and start working to restructure both the Chaebol and the Korean banks and non-bank financial institutions.
So the IMF package comes in, and for many people this becomes the end of the story because the Korean market does bounce back quite quickly. But I'm going to get you to touch on some very interesting aspects of it, the internal aspects inside Korean society, because you were there and you must have seen these things, and it must have had you must have got an insight into the Korean mind from how they responded to the crisis itself. Now, Korea is in some ways a patriarchal society where they trust governments and things like this, and it's a society that values itself a lot around its economic success. So the idea of mass layoffs and temporary workers is a very un-Korean kind of idea. So there were protests on the streets against the IMF itself. There was a certain amount of social stigma in Korea that we had failed and these foreigners had to come in and help us out. And there was this extremely, I suppose, sort of heartwarming image of Korean families rummaging through their drawers, looking for gold necklaces, gold bracelets, gold jewelry, and bringing it in and giving it free to the Korean government to be melted down and added to the Korean reserves.
Yeah, I never looked into that in detail. I mean, there was a lot of imagery of Korean Ajumak bringing the gold and handing it in. I'm not sure it was a gift. I think it might have been valued, and they would get compensation for that in the fullness of time. Not something I was an expert on. But one of the things that was notable about this experience, I mean, it created a long-term structural unemployment situation, right? I mean, until the crisis, unemployment, until, through the end of 1996, unemployment rates in Korea were about 2%. By the end of 1998, it had risen to 6.8%. In 1999, it came down to 6.3%. 2000, it came down to 4%. So, for that 3-year period, you really had an extra 2 to 5% of the population that was unemployed, right? This was a pretty unusual situation for Korea. I mean, of course, the country had developed out of extreme poverty after the Korean War. I mean, it was an incredibly poor country in 1960. So, but it was tough. Only 37 years later to have this happen again. And in that type of situation, it's typically families that have just moved into the middle class that are the ones who suffer. So, I mean, there are probably still families out there who the 1997 crisis was a major family disaster, and they probably have still not recovered from it, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's one of those things that stings some people's minds, but it's also one of those things that, and this comes to, I suppose, the final topic here, that because Korea did bounce back so well, that in hindsight, people that don't have a memory, often the younger people, they don't see it as a crisis because it was relatively brief and Korea bounced back very, very quickly. So this brings us to the last topic here, and it's very interesting how you put it, and I quite like the phrase in here, was this a waste of a perfectly good crisis? Now, there was some, of course, you mentioned the IMF restructuring, and of course the Chaebol was deleveraged, the financial sector was restructured to a degree, but in a sense, there was also a lot of missed opportunity here.
Yeah, I think that's right. I always like the Chinese characters, the hanzi for the word crisis. It's two characters in Chinese. One means danger, and the other means opportunity. I think that's a good way to think about it. There was certainly a lot of danger in this crisis, but did Korea, in fact, get enough out of it? One of the things noticeable about the recovery of the Korean financial sector was that so little of it had to do with new foreign capital coming into the Korean banks. There are some banks that are new. You've got some foreign banks now that have a bigger profile in Korea than they did before the crisis. For instance, Citibank and HSBC. But and there were some small efforts or small forays where you had foreign banks or foreign investors taking control of Korean banks. And I don't have those names matched up in front of me, but Commerzbank had been at Korea Exchange Bank, and I forget which bank they were affiliated with, but Lone Star, the American private equity investors, were in there, and they had a very difficult time, and they exited. There were some legal challenges that Lone Star had to fend off. And I think one of the perhaps missed opportunities for Korea was in the financial sector, and having at least a few Korean banks, majority owned by other Asian, North American, or European banks. And I think that would have raised the level of play in the Korean financial sector. I mean, it's interesting now, if you look at the World Economic Forum's Global Competitiveness Report, a recent one, and you look at Korea versus China versus Japan versus Singapore, and you look at indicators in that report for financial sector performance, including responsiveness, affordability, soundness of banks, capital market availability, venture capital availability. Korea is far, far, far behind Singapore and Japan, And in almost all of these measures, it's even pretty far behind China, which was startling when I pulled these numbers together. And on the Chaebol side, it's interesting. I mean, the top five Chaebol revenue represented 67% of GDP, or equated to 67% of GDP in 1997. As of 2010, it was still 58%. I mean, these are massive operations. So looking at things like freedom of dominance by big business groups, freedom for foreign direct investors to come in, or protection of minority shareholders, or labor relations. Again, if you compare Korea with Singapore, Japan, and China, Korea is far behind Singapore and Japan, and it's even pretty far behind China in freedom from dominance by big groups, freedom for foreign direct investment, protection of minority shareholders, which boggles the mind, and labor business relations. So, there has been more foreign direct investment in the corporate sector, in the real sector, in Korea since the crisis. But, these Chaebol continue to operate as they did before. And, they are so big and they are into everything. I mean, one of the Chaebol, known for its electronics and construction business, also has huge operations in restaurants. You wonder what impact having such large industrial conglomerates involved in everything has on the development of small and medium enterprises.
So as a final question here, what do you put that lack of change down to? I mean, I've heard some people look at this from different angles. They say things like the Chaebol were resistant to change. They felt attached to the idea that they had grown Korea and one crisis shouldn't be the end of their business models as a small blip. And other people say things like people in high-ranking people high up in government were investors in many of these Chaebols, and they didn't want to structurally reform them too much. They wanted their growth to rapidly bounce back. And I'll go to something you said here as well. You said that Chaebol reform in some way looks more like harassment than reform.
Yeah, I mean, you've got a very active free trade commission that looks into Chaebol malpractice. There are regularly admonitions that a Chaebol should divest such and such an affiliate, or reduce its cross shareholdings, or whatever. And it's just a lot of one-off, I think, government intervention and trying to administer the role of the Chaebol in the economy. I think they'd be much better off if they did two things. I mean, if they thought about the impact of these Chaebol on competition, and whether or not these Chaebol are able to thwart competition and thwart market entry and growth by small and medium enterprises. I mean, Korea might need a more robust competition policy in order to encourage small and medium enterprise development. And I think the other thing is that, it's very difficult for governments to try to administer corporate activity. It's a little bit like Donald Trump telling Harley Davidson they can't build a motorcycle factory in France. I mean, it's just sort of ridiculous, right? So I think a more sustainable approach in Korea for getting the Chaebol under control, in addition to competition policy, would be to have more robust corporate governance at these Chaebol, right? And making sure that each affiliate has a majority of independent directors on its board of directors. There should be, I think, a separation between the role of the CEO and the chairman of the board of directors. The board of directors should have fiduciary responsibility and liability for protecting the interests of public shareholders. And there should be perhaps more opportunity for public shareholders to sue directors and sue the corporation for either specific performance or for financial remuneration if things go wrong.
So, on that positive look into the future, I suppose that's a pretty good spot to leave it here. Yeah, it's been a pleasure. So, William Mako, thanks for coming on the Career Now podcast.
Great. Thank you for having me.